Way back in the ancient times of the turn of the millennium, I had a crazy idea. Website creation was all the rage, and I wanted to create my own video game website. But rather than review current video games like the IGNs and the GameSpots of the world did back then, I wanted to review older games, obscure games, games that had already, even in the early 2000s, started to be lost to time. And if you're confused by that statement, I promise IGN and GameSpot used to review video games. Although I'll readily admit I have no idea what they do now, as I can't even remember the last time I went to either site. So I fired up a copy of Microsoft Front Page, and if you don't know what that is, you'd be forgiven because the last version of Front Page was released in 2003. You see, not only do we discuss ancient video games and websites that no one's been to in 10 years, we also apparently discuss Microsoft products that are old enough to vote here. That reminds me, I really miss Microsoft Streets and Trips. Damn Google and their precious maps. Anyway, Front Page was Microsoft's website editor, and it was really cool because it had FTP functionality built into it to where you could create your website in Front Page and then click a button and Front Page would save your changes to your web host. This made it easy to create a video game review template and then pick a game, get a few screenshots, and type up a quick review, and boom, the website has a new review on it. It was certainly a lot quicker than writing, editing, and shooting a 20-minute video, I'll tell you that much. However, I should probably pause for a second because I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me and are completely lost because instead of reviewing a video game, I've spent the entire video so far talking about dead software. Hi, my name is Dave and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where I'm here to remind you it's all dead software. You may just not know it yet. Anyway, I'm out to collect and review the nearly 1,280 titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. The whole point of the previous 3 paragraphs was that way back when I had the insane goal of reviewing every game that was playable in MAME, back when it was just an arcade emulator. One of the games in MAME back then was Wizard of Wor, and that's War, W-O-R. Wizard of Wor was an arcade game from Midway that dates back to 1980, and it was a maze shooter, so think like Berserk or Gauntlet. Now, I've never actually played Wizard of Wor, but due to working on the website, I at least knew of its existence, and the fact that it was eventually ported to the Genesis, because I remembered seeing it advertised in gaming magazines back in the day. Except it wasn't. No, see, today's game isn't Wizard of Wor, it's Wings of Wor, and it's just a weird coincidence that both games spell War, W-O-R. You can see why I'd be confused, and it gets even worse because the game isn't known as Wings of Wor in Japan and Europe. Oh no, there it's known as Gynoug. At least I think that's how it's pronounced. Anyway, now that I know that I'm just illiterate, I should probably sit down and play this game that's not an arcade port. Will it be any good? What's a Gynoug? And what the hell is the game even about? Well, I'll try to figure all that out, but first, a look at this uncommon package.
And here's my copy of Wings of Wor. And yes, that's Wings, not Wizard. I'm not going to screw that one up again. I hope. Anyway, this particular copy is in pretty nice shape. It's not perfect. The hang tab has been removed at the top of the case. But other than that, the outer cover is held up well with just some minor blemishes here and there. The inner cover appears to perhaps be slightly faded from a color perspective, but that's probably somewhat normal for a game of this age, as it doesn't appear to be sun-bleached specifically, and it's structurally intact with no water damage or edge wear. With this being a particularly uncommon title, as most early third-party releases for the Genesis are, I'm more than happy to just keep this copy in the collection, but if for some reason I wanted to replace it, complete copies are currently averaging $100, and then potentially up from there depending on condition. The cover art is fantastic, and it's real art, something similar to what you might have seen on any number of fantasy novels from the era. I don't mean to be dismissive of the work done on other game covers, but in this case, US publisher DreamWorks, not to be confused with the film studio that wouldn't exist for another 3 years at that point, decided that they really wanted to make an impact and went with painter Boris Vallejo for a fresh take on the game for the US audiences. Boris was apparently pretty busy with Genesis-related artwork in 1991 because not only did he paint this, but he was also responsible for the covers of many of Accolade's early releases as well. The original artwork for Gynoug, as the game was called in Japan and then maintained for its European release, isn't shabby either, and along with the title, the art was reused as well. However, I definitely have to give this one to Japan since the art isn't included by the cover formatting. As far as the Japanese version versus the US version though, that's tough. I think the Boris Vallejo art is just slightly better, but the Gynoug logo is much cooler, so it's kind of a wash. Whichever version you pick up, I think you'll be happy with the cover. Flipping over the back, and the layout is pretty simple and actually somewhat similar to what you'd see on a first-party release early on, with one large screenshot and then two smaller ones down below, and then text above and over to the side. The screenshots are of good quality, but unfortunately this is a dark game in places, and those particular scenes don't translate well, so they probably could have done a better job of picking which screens to use to make the game look better. The flavor text to the side is decent, but there's a few places where you can tell they probably needed to have a English proofreader, like say where it says, "most grotesque dangerous creatures ever," probably should have been reworded to "most dangerous and grotesque" instead. But I do like the final tagline, "get ready for the flight of your life." That's a nice under-the-radar pun there. Opening up the package, and the manual has seen some use, but it's fully intact. The cartridge is clearly a former rental copy from the stickers on the front and the back, and I'd love to remove them, but taking off that front one at least is going to damage the label, so I'm leaving that alone. You might be curious about the plain black and white label, and believe it or not, that's just something that DreamWorks did, and all of their releases, except for their last one, Mystical Fighter, had similar black and white cartridge labels. The manual is a nice to have as the game isn't too terribly complicated, and you can probably figure out what everything does on your own, but I still like being able to look up what all of the items are, and it's fun to look at the names and pictures of the various bosses, which they were clearly very creative with. Although I've got to say, I think it would be funny if randomly one of the bosses was just named Sam or Bob or something. Maybe that's just me. Okay, that's the package. Let's fly the unfriendly skies and see what Planet Icus has in store. Maybe it's just me, but there's something I find very relaxing about playing a standard scrolling shooter, whether it's the horizontal or vertical variety. And that might sound patently insane, especially if when you think of a scrolling shooter, you think of the bullet hell variety, like say an Ikaruga or Mars Matrix. And yes, those aren't relaxing, and to be frank, as impressive as games like that are, I don't find them particularly fun due to the extreme amount of chaos on the screen. Sometimes less is more. But back in the day, before things got too crazy, I always thought it was fun to be able to sit down and play a shooter where literally your only objective was to blow shit up. Tanks, blow them up. Planes, blow them up. Buildings that might secretly be hiding power-ups? Oh, you know we are blowing those up, there's no question. And all you had to do? Shoot. Shoot and don't stop shooting. There were no weird button combinations or having to remember exactly which button does what. The most complicated thing you had to deal with was using a controller that supported rapid fire if it wasn't built into the game itself. Wings of Wor fits right into that era, where shooters were still relatively simple, but also trying slightly different things to set them apart from one another. One of those things here is the story. Now, you might think, it's a shooter, why does it need to have a story? And you're right, for many action games, the plot takes a back seat to what's going on screen, and maybe, just maybe, if the game is good enough, they'll retcon the story in a sequel/prequel to try to make sense of what came before, as we've seen in Halo Reach, or what's currently going on in the Doom series. While that eventual world building is great and all, I really appreciate when they at least make the effort out of the box, and while the story in Wings of Wor isn't exactly deep, it's at least there. You play as Wor, or I guess Gynoug in the Japanese/European version, who is a member of a race of winged men and lives on the planet Icus. Icus has apparently been ravaged by some sort of virus that mutates creatures on the planet, and Wor, being a leader of the winged warriors, has set out to try to destroy the Destroyer, who is responsible for the viral spread on Icus. As mentioned, it's not a very deep plot, but it at least exists and explains why you're fighting all sorts of creatures in different areas on the planet who are in varying states of mutation. The creativity is a nice touch, and it matters for setting the game apart from other shooters. It might seem like it's a small detail to be in control of a person rather than just another spaceship, when they're both effectively doing the same thing, but it does change the feeling of the game, and adds that dark fantasy element that most shooters eschew for a sci-fi feel. Previously, we've looked at both the Genesis and Master System versions of Forgotten Worlds on the channel, and it's hard to play Wings of Wor without thinking that the developers were at least influenced by that game, but still managed to create their own thing. While it's all well and good for a game to have a unique story, everything else that's included has to back that up as well. Each of the first 5 levels in the game has a completely different setting. You're not just flying through similar looking space stations or post-apocalyptic scenarios, they all have their own individual character, and some even change as you progress through the level. For instance, starting out in the skies above the water in the second level before making your way to a ship graveyard under the sea. It does raise the question of how Wor can fly underwater, but in a game like this, physics probably shouldn't be your primary focus. However, not only do levels feature unique environments, there's lots of really advanced programming techniques going on as well, which enhance the environments even more. There's lots of parallax scrolling and multiple layers to the backgrounds, and in places, they're not just static layers. Oh no, they're moving around. This combined with some foreground transparencies make for a lot of action on screen before even taking into effect your shots, special attacks, and the various enemies that you're facing. Also, in another similarity to Forgotten Worlds, it has to be mentioned that this is all being done while not just traveling from left to right, as in certain sections you're also going to be moving diagonally up and down, so the programmers had to take that into consideration as well. Along with how the levels are constructed, there's other programming tricks here and there that shake things up quite literally. It occurs early on, but there's a sequence where the screen starts to shift back and forth, simulating an earthquake, and I'm not sure that I've seen that special effect used on the console before. Perhaps in some of the later Konami releases like Contra Hardcore or Castlevania Bloodlines, but keep in mind those games were released much later on the console by a significantly larger company. So the fact that the programmers at NCS were able to figure out and implement some of these technical tricks when they did is pretty amazing. It's not good enough for a game to just be technically impressive though. There's plenty of shooters out there where the developers have tried to just get by with large enemies or tons of sprites on the screen, and that's all well and good, but what about what's actually being drawn on the screen? Is it interesting, or is it just some kind of bland, generic enemy that potentially gets repeated later on with just a palette swap? Well, I can certainly say that Wings of Wor is one of the most interesting looking shooters that I've played, just from a purely art perspective, and not even taking any of the special effects that I've mentioned into consideration. When it was mentioned that Icus was taken over by a mutating virus, the designers took that and ran with it, with the enemies ranging from just ordinary birds and fishes to all sorts of grotesque monsters. It really is a game, to borrow a term from Stephen King, of nightmares and dreamscapes. Since I have very little artistic talent of my own, as I'm sure that everyone that's familiar with the channel knows already, I can only look at the assortment of enemy creatures from the game and wonder just how in the hell did they come up with this? Specifically, when I got to the 4th level boss for the first time, all I could think was WTF. And then of course I died almost instantly because I was too busy trying to wrap my head around what I was looking at. As great as the graphics are in the game, the sound is probably a step behind. It's not bad at all, don't get me wrong, it's just not nearly as impressive as the graphics. And maybe it's an issue of inconsistency or personal preference as well, because I would say that some of the music tracks are better than others. For instance, the music for the first section of the first level is just okay to me, but then after that the tracks seem to get better. Not exactly sure why that is, and again, could be a personal preference issue on my part, but some of the improvement seems to be related to the way that the music is paired to the levels. Specifically with the second level having a bit of a sea shanty to go along with the sunken pirate ships, the third level having a gothy sound that seems to reflect the cathedral nature of the level, and then the fourth sounding more mechanical factory-esque. While the music appears to pick up as you go, the sound effects never really get going. Again, they're not bad, but when compared to the graphics and the music, the sound effects are just kinda there, and they do the job, but there's no standout explosions or speech or anything that you really would take notice of. I've spent a lot of time talking about how the game looks and sounds, but what about how it plays, since that's just as important? Well, thankfully, I can report that it plays really well. The movement is very crisp and precise, which is a must for some of the attacks that you have to avoid. I've died plenty of times when playing this last week, and while sometimes the game can be tricky about what it throws at you, it never felt unfair or cheap, and almost always when I died, it was because I was distracted or out of position, with the clear answer being not that the developers did something wrong, but that I needed to get good myself. Beyond just moving war around the screen as is normal in shooters, there's plenty of power-ups for you to obtain to make your journey easier. You can get wings to make you move quicker, power-ups for your shot to give you more base offense, and collect special weapons as you go through the level, of which you can store 3 at a time. Pretty standard stuff, and I've got both a complaint and praise for it. Let's get the complaint out of the way first. When playing, you'll collect both red and blue orbs, which are used to power up the amount of power in your shot, and then just how much of a shot you have. This is done via meters that go from 1 to 5 orbs. The problem is, it's unclear of how many of each orb you have to collect to go up a level. It's not 1 orb per level, and it's not an orb for the number of the level, i.e. 2 orbs for level 2, 3 orbs for level 3, etc. To me, it appeared somewhat random, and the manual doesn't explain it either. When you die, you only lose 1 level, which is nice, but it would be better if the system made a bit more sense. The praise that I have is for the special attack system. There's 8 different special attacks that can be collected, and of course, some are more useful than others depending on the scenario. This in and of itself isn't that novel, but what I like is the fact that you can collect up to 3 attacks in slots, so that you're not just constantly replacing what you have with a new one. And you can choose when to activate them. Along with that, there's also some strategy behind which attacks you collect, because if you can manage to stack them in order, when you activate them, they'll combine and become more powerful, which might be the difference between surviving a particular boss. Wings of Wor is pretty much everything I could possibly want in an early third-party title on the Genesis. If I had one issue with the game beyond the petty stuff that I've mentioned previously, it's that the last level is essentially just a boss rush, and I'm not a fan of those in general, as they seem lazy to me. I mean, I've already beaten all of those enemies, why do I have to do it again? But even with that, some people like the challenge of those types of levels, so maybe that wouldn't even be an issue for you. Having said that, due to the creativity involved in the game, the technical wizardry, the fact that everything is crammed into only 4 megabits, which is ridiculous, and the fact that the code dates back to 1990, I'm giving Wings of Wor 4 stars. It's an excellent shooter for the Genesis, no matter what name it goes by where you live.
And that's it for Wings of Wor on the Genesis, or Gynoug on the Mega Drive, or whatever you want to call it. Just make sure that you don't confuse it with Wizard of Wor like I did. I'm not sure that any retro game is worth the ridiculous amount of money that they tend to go for, but at least in this case, you'd be getting a quality product if you choose to invest in it. However, if you don't want to hand over $100 for a copy and you don't want to wade into the gray legal areas of emulation, it is available on all modern consoles as well, so there's no excuse for you if you want to play it for yourself. It's not my favorite shooter on the Genesis, but it's damn good. Next time on the channel, I'm playing the last game in a series that appeared on these 4 consoles, and yet it's also the first game in the series. That probably sounds a bit confusing, but it's actually not the only time this situation is going to come up, as it will happen again whenever I finally start to review the Afterburner games. However, it might not be the last game in the series that I review. That will depend on if I ever figure out a good way to deal with the Master System 3D titles. I suppose you'll just have to keep an eye on this space to see. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 261. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.